Can we do cities better? This is a question people are asking the world over. There is a striving for improvement and a need for success to attract the best talent and have happier, healthier, and better off populations. But as the world urbanizes, it's not clear that we've got cities right. My guest today, Heba Elhanafy, and the Charters in Cities Institute think they may have a way forward. And she joins me now. Heba Elhanafy, welcome to Smarter Cities.
Thank you, Jason, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
No, it's good. So thank you very much for dialing in early from Zambia. You're my first Zambian guest, so it's an absolute pleasure to have you on board. And a really interesting topic around the Charter Cities Institute. I hadn't heard of your not-for-profit before, so I'm really keen to hear about what you're doing and what's been going on there. Before I get into it, however, you've got an amazing background, and when we talked last time, I was really sort of taken with your background and how you got to do what you've been doing. So how did you end up in Zambia trying to get better cities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I ask myself that question every single day. No.
Sure you do.
So my background is I studied architecture for my bachelor's degree. And in our school, we get like a minor, right? So from there, I minored in urban planning. And then just once I started like studying urban planning, I realized that architecture sucks and like this is not the way to change the world. Planning is.
And where
And
did
then
you go to university? Sorry, Heba.
yeah, so I went to university in Alexandria, Egypt. So I'm originally Egyptian from Alexandria, Egypt, and yeah, I went to school there. And Alexandria in itself is a very interesting city because you have all this layer of history, but you also have all this layer of modernity coming together, and it's just like an absolute mess. So there was a lot to learn from the city and a lot to observe as well as growing up. Um, and after that, yeah, I kind of got more involved with urban development projects and community development projects on the ground in Egypt and Tunis because this was where I was based after that. And this is when I realized that urban planning also doesn't change the world, and this is how we need to look at things a little bit more holistically through an urban development lens. And this is where I went. I did my master's degree in Germany and worked there a little bit in different organizations, and then moved to the Charter Cities Institute in DC in the US. And then when they opened the new kind of Africa office here in Lusaka, I was like, hey guys, can I move to Lusaka? It sounds interesting. I have never lived in sub-Saharan cities before. And they were like, yeah, go ahead. So yeah, this is how I ended up in Lusaka. And
So Alexandria to Germany to DC to Lusaka in Zambia
yes,
in the space of just a few years. I mean, that's quite a remarkable quite a remarkable journey.
yes. Most of my clothes are everywhere around the world, but yeah, that's that's okay. That's a story for another day.
And how are you finding a Zambian experience? I mean, you've been, apart from obviously you're Egyptian from Alexandria, but you've been in sort of developed cities for quite some time, and now you're sort of in a sub-Saharan environment. Are there things that are different, really different, or are you finding commonality in how people live and work and succeed in a Zambian city?
So I think generally people do things, people do certain things all the same way, but cities functions differently, right? So as a general rule, you would always find um, if the city has informal development, you will always find the informal development near transportation systems, near workplaces, near economic opportunities. You would always find informal ways of getting around the city, informal economies. These kind of things you would find generally in all of like developing cities. So this is something that's like generally in common. But what I think is different or very interesting about Lusaka generally, or I would say other sub-Saharan cities, but Lusaka very specifically. And I was really struck by it. Like I read a lot about it and I did some research on it before I came. But like the amount of sprawl here, so you have a tiny, teeny bit of like downtown with a little bit of density, and then the city sprawls for miles and miles and
Right.
miles. So
Right.
although it's the whole population of uh, Lusaka can honestly fit in literally one neighborhood in Alexandria, it just
Wow.
goes for
So
like it
density, there's a urban sprawl is a real issue
is
in
it's
this.
huge and you can feel it, and like the effects of it is are very clear. So the land values, like the amount of money we pay here is almost as close to the amount of money you would pay for an apartment in DC, which says a lot about a city. I
Sorry,
mean,
just say
again,
that again. The
yes,
apartment
yes,
prices in rental for Lusaka is almost the same as an apartment price in DC.
it's a new developments, yes, like the new safe developments that like as an expat you would live in is I'm almost paying what I paid in DC a year ago. So yeah.
Wow. And is it
So
same size or different size or quality? I
it's
mean, because presumably in Lusaka, you're living in quite a high-end neighborhood as an expatriate, right?
yeah, you live in a bit of a like higher end neighborhood, of course, but the size is not that different. Um, and it is a new development, so yeah, it is very kind of fancy-ish and whatever, but it's still very expensive if you compare it, for instance, to the Egyptian prices. Um, yeah, so it's a very interesting city in the way it kind of functions or dysfunctions as well. Like there is a lot to take in.
What's the sort of economic drivers of the city, Lusaka? What makes it tick as a city? Is it sort of a financial hub or is it a manufacturing hub in Zambia? What does it do?
So yeah, it is also financial and administrative hub. So the government resides here, and all of like the businesses, all of the international orgs and whatever, they all are
So it's
based
really
here.
it is a proper capital city in a way.
Yeah, it is a proper capital city in the way it operates. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Well, look, it's quite the journey you've had. Um, and just in the first sort of 10 minutes of our conversation, you can see you're really kind of into cities. But tell us a little bit about the Charter Cities Institute. So, one of the things I'm amazed with in America is the number of really interesting not-for-profits that are doing things overseas. And, from an Australian perspective, it's really great to see. Um, how did the institute form? Where do you get your financial backing from, and why have you started in Africa?
So the Charter Cities Institute is a think tank, non-profit based. We're currently in DC and Lusaka, and it was started in 2017 by our founder and former executive director Mark Luther. And basically goal is to promote or enhance the ecosystem for charter cities through creating partnerships, through creating research, and also communicating the message generally. Um, where do we get our financial backing as any nonprofit in in the US? We get it from both private donors and also institutional backing. So we get it from various of different resources of people who believe either in the cause or from people who want to, or organizations who want to back our research or the kind of thing that we do. Why did we open an office in Africa? Because I mean, if honestly, if you just look at the urbanization rate, 90% of urbanization is going to happen, and population increase is going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years is going to happen in African and Asian cities. And a lot look at Africa as the last frontier for urbanization. Like
Mm.
America already urbanized, Europe already urbanized. The next level of urbanization is going to happen in Africa. And we feel that Africa has a very kind of critical, it's at a critical point where right now we either get urbanization right or we're just going to repeat the last 50 years of really bad urban decisions. And they're going to manifest even harder because, of course, the urbanization rates are even more substantial throughout the next 15 years. So we felt there is a need for us to exist on the ground in Africa, and especially we were working with a couple of charter city-esque projects around the continent. So we felt that okay, it makes sense for us to start. This.
Fascinating. But I mean, there's so many questions I could ask there, but I guess for the audience, we should really define what a charter city is. So what is a charter city?
So basically, a charter city is a new city, a greenfield development with new rules. And here you would ask me two questions, right? Why new rules and why new cities? Why new rules? Because the current rules completely suck and we need to change them. And I think there is a global agreement of the fact that urban rules are not working, something is not working. And the new cities is basically just based on population increase and urbanization rate that's going to happen in the next 15 years. There is a huge cause in making current cities equipped for that population increase, but there is also a need to build new cities and build them right, right? And if we look at the number of cities that are being, number of new greenfield cities that are being built, around 200 new cities are being built currently around the
There are
world.
200 greenfield
200
cities. Really?
200 greenfield new cities that are being built currently all over the world. Um, can give you some citation later, but this is the reality of what's happening. And there is
It's okay. It's a
like,
podcast. We'll
yeah,
take it as read.
exactly. Sorry, I'm a researcher, so I'm like, I
That's
need to give
okay.
him the
But
citation. He needs to believe me.
whereabouts are the cities? I mean, are they mostly in Africa? Are they? I mean, I know China is creating a whole bunch of new cities. Where are the
Yeah.
cities coming from? The new ones
So, just of a personal experience, I know there are like 21 new cities that are being built currently in Egypt, in different
in
stages, but
Egypt. In Egypt, really?
just 21 new cities that are being built, including the fourth stage, I think, or the fifth stage of the administrative capital, which hasn't been officially opened. So for just for Egypt, there are like out of the 200, there are 21 new cities that are operating there, right? You have a lot of new cities that are happening in Asia, and as well a lot of new cities that are happening in Africa, both driven by private developers and governments. So, for instance, Malawi's, we're working with them on this secondary cities plan, which they're planning to basically kind of forecast the urbanization rates that are going to happen over 15 years through building a bunch of new development and new greenfield cities around the country.
So when you say it's a greenfield city, what does that mean? Does it mean that look? So a lot of these areas are highly populated already, right?
Yeah.
So when you say it's a new greenfield city, just walk me through what that means. Like, are we're talking we're taking low level village like places and densifying them, like perhaps we've seen in China a few times, or is it, a planning decision? We're going to create a new administrative capital like what they're doing in Indonesia.
Yeah. So, like when we say new cities with new rules, this is the Charter Cities Institute definition of a charter city, or what we think ideally would be a charter city, right? Because the need for kind of new rules or robust governance changes will operate politically and economically better on a new field development, right? So it's easier when you're creating a new cities that you create like a new set of rules or a robust mechanism for investment or whatever than to go in an existing city that has been there for hundreds and sometimes even thousands of
Yeah.
years, and then change the current systems and have to go through all the political channels and all like the power balances and everything. So that's why we feel like, okay, if we really want to do robust governance enhancement and changes, it would be better done on a greenfield site. And since we know that there are a lot of cities that are being developed and the need for new cities to being developed, so why not make them chartered? Why not we actually dig a little bit more into the governance aspect of creating a new city and make it actually better for investment and these kinds of stuff. So this is kind of how we look at like a perfect charter city model. But anyways, the core of the idea of charter city is just enhancing governance and enabling city level leadership to have more control over its own decisions. Um, again and again, especially in Africa, you see a lot of problems that goes back to the like cities trying to do something and then the national law doesn't allow it, or the political system doesn't allow it, or this kind of stuff. And we believe cities operate better, and I think there is a general consensus on that. Like cities operate better when they have when they can actually operate, when they can actually do their thing, when they can actually be responsive and adaptable to the changes. So more decentralization on the city level, more governance on the city level is basically what.
So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, to me, I mean, we have three tiers of government in Australia and a population of 27 million people. So you're a small population with lots of governance, and you find significant conflict between state and federal, state, and local government. And at a city level, you find you find tremendous conflict between very, very small local governments that are responsible for planning, and then a state administration that has broader economic agenda that it wants to deliver, which results in more density. So there's a conflict. You have communities that don't want more density, a state administration that wants more density, and a federal administration that wants even further density because they want to have more migration to keep the economy kind of growing. So there's a wonderful conflict. But I just want to take you back a little bit to what you're saying about the new rules and new governance in a city. You've said in your writings that urban settlements have a long and proud past, and advanced civilization was established through them. In my experience, that would mean like Egypt is one of the oldest countries on earth. Surely there isn't capacity to sort of say new rules, new governance in a place like that. Politicians have been doing what they do for generations. So if you decide to build a new city, we already know what we're doing. Why would we listen to the Charter Cities Institute view of new rules and new governance? What we have already works. Is that right?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, depends on how you define works, right? So
Yes. And
you
I'm
just
being
mentioned,
provocative, by the way. I'm not suggesting it's
yeah,
working. I'm
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
putting
So
forward the Egyptian government official view that
yeah,
I've
okay.
got.
So yeah, well, I have to go there then. Okay, so you said that Australia is around 27 million, right? So Cairo in itself is around 27 million, right?
Just
And
one city. Yeah.
just one city, just Cairo, right? Like Cairo the mess, but it's around 27 million. Official, like the official numbers are around 20, the unofficial numbers are around 25, 26. So let's say 27 million. And 70% of that uh, 25, 27, let's even say it's 20 million, is informal settlements. And although the informal settlements in Cairo, compared to the rest of the informal settlements in Egypt around the world, are very um, advanced in a sense of they do have access to water, they do have access to
Right.
electricity.
So this
They're
is not
quite
like the Dharavi slum that does not have
no no
access to
no
water, sewage. These are
no 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 no.
informal in the sense that they're not planned settlements, but they are infrastructure connected settlements.
They became infrastructure connected in like the 1990s. So
Right.
they started in the 1960s. They became in connected. Most of them became connected to the infrastructure in the 1990s, and then speculation happened. And then now you can go to informal settlements that are like 14 stories high and 15 stories
Right.
high. There,
Yeah.
yeah, like you wouldn't
Really?
even know that. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, completely. Like all of the most of the informal
So you've
settlements
got buildings that are 14, 15 stories high, and it's
that are
considered an
informal.
informal settlement.
Yeah, and no one has access to land value, land ownership or anything on that land. But that shows that there is a failure on the governance side to kind of predict that population increase and to equitably plan for it, right? And we have tons of research that shows that providing infrastructure after people build is actually more costly, and that's
Yeah.
completely doesn't make any sense uh, when you like when then providing infrastructure prior to that. And the government had, like, I mean, when you have millions and millions and millions of people living without infrastructure, at a certain point something has to happen and you will have to provide the infrastructure, which the government did at a certain point, but would
Mm.
have made a lot more sense, and probably the development of those settlements would have looked completely different if they had an upfront infrastructure push from the government, right? Um,
100%.
Yeah,
I think
so
that goes without saying, right? I mean, if you're connecting something after someone's decided to be there, it's always more expensive. But just your question on land tenure. So the people don't own the land, but they must own. There must be some private ownership
it's
within
it,
the informal
it,
settlement, right?
yes, it is, but it is quite like complicated and has like different decisions by different governments that came throughout the past 30 years that have decided different things, right? So at a certain point, it was enough for you to have access to electricity, which means that you have like some sort of a contract with the government. So like having that access to electricity would mean that you have like a de facto land ownership, right? Um, a de facto land,
Yeah.
but the
Well,
but
you have
the
tenure,
thing,
right? You've got tenure.
you have a sort of a paper with your address on it and your name on it, and that's how you can like even go to the government and then put that address on your ID. So it's like a de facto ownership, but it's not really ownership. So when the government, so right now, for instance, the government is doing all of this kind of infrastructure upgrade or whatever, and a lot of people are being moved from their houses and being displaced and whatever. Although like they would show you, oh, we have this kind of paper from the government that says that we live here or this kind of stuff. But as long as you don't really have land ownership or you don't really have some sort of an ownership, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But there are private ownership within the land. So the people who develop the 14-story
Yeah.
high buildings or whatever, um, they rent it out to people or sell it to people that actually kind of
Sure.
now have thinking of
But
living on.
that's the really interesting debate, isn't it, on urban renewal in cities? You know, and every city that I work in, it's the same thing. And if you're renewing a housing estate or something where existing people live, you have to displace those people in order to replace the asset, right? And particularly where there's been a long-serving community in that space that's grown up over time, and you're saying to them, look, this area is no longer fit for purpose. We need to renew it. That's a highly contentious thing. We see it in the US all the time in most Western cities. And then, of course, you have this concept of gentrification, where all of a sudden you've got, an existing sort of industrialized community, perhaps, or, working class community, and all of a sudden hipsters who like coffee and cheese arrive, forced into the area, and all of a sudden these trendy boutiques start coming up, and all of a sudden you're like, well, what's happened here? I can't afford to live here anymore. That's a trend you see in Western cities. But what you're telling me is that sort of displacement narrative might be on steroids in um, some emerging cities, because you're taking areas that might be informal and saying, okay, I'm going to build a city on these things now. I'm going to displace these people and build a new city. Is that is that right? Have I interpreted that correctly?
Um, in Cairo, what's happening right now is quite close to that, right? Because um, again, people are really smart, right? Communities are really smart. If I'm leaving my house back in the village and I'm going to Cairo, middle of nowhere, and I know that I'm gonna have like a work opportunity somewhere in downtown. I don't really have money to subscribe to the formal economy. I'm just going to build my informal settlement next to that downtown, next to that work opportunity, right? So people
Mhm.
are really smart. So you find, and this is like a trend that I can almost say like everywhere, right? Um, Informal settlements lie always on one of the highest valued land, usually in very in dense cities.
Yes. Yeah.
You find informal, like they have the best land, they have the best views, they have the best whatever, and they just don't have access to proper living, but they just have a really good land value that they're sitting upon. So after a certain point, if the government has enough capacity, they just realize that, oh, those people are sitting on one of the highest land valued places. And especially when it comes to like capital cities, it's probably the whole country, right? Not just the capital city. So there is a lot of things that we can do differently on that land. I think up till now, the kind of displacement narratives have not been ideal. What the governments have been doing generally throughout history, and the inclusion of those communities who exist to in the upgrade or in the displacement or in whatever you call it process has not been quite ideal. I mean, those people generally people exist in lands for like 100 years or 60
Hundreds,
years.
yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
most of the former settlements in Cairo started in the 1940s and 1960s with a huge urbanization push post colonization. And you can't come up to a person who lived there for like 70 years and tell them, oh, yeah, you live in an informal settlement, you need to move now. It's like, I've been there for 70 years, you know, like, um, so yeah, I think it's just the process of how you do it or how you move communities or how you actually make the best use out of that land is it's always been problematic. And I think it's always going to be, and that's where like new cities can learn a lot from what has been happening in the past 60 years and like the urbanization boom all over the global south, right? It's like, hey, you know, we need to get things right or try to, you know, like we're not going to 100% get everything right, but we can try to do things differently. We can try to learn from all of those lessons, because at the end of the day, those processes of displacement are, no matter how hard you try to make them right, there
They-
somebody's
They're,
always gonna get hurt, right?
they're
Always,
always very painful, right? And
always,
you think of
100%.
Brazilian favelas or Indian slums, or even parts of Paris that are being renewed right now. The
Yeah,
displacement there that's going on of largely migrant communities. I don't know of any examples where it's been an easy process.
exactly, exactly. So that's why it's like there is a lot of okay, let's try to do things differently. Let's try to look at planning in a different way. Let's look at the like communities slash city in a like their connection in a different way, so we wouldn't have to go through this again. Because at a certain point, if we do things exactly the same way, we're gonna end up with the same results. There is yeah.
So you're there. Your government says to you, okay, Heba, I'm going to clear this area of land, of people, and I'm going to create a new city. So where's the first step? Do they you say to them, okay, you need new rules, new governance, right? How do you go about dealing with that challenge?
Yeah, and that's why we say greenfield size. So like, let's try to stay, you know, as far away from existing dense communities as much as possible. We
But
know
how
that
many how many greenfield sites are there really in the world? Like in a country like Egypt, or even in Zambia, where you've got huge urban sprawl, how much greenfield is there? Is there? I mean, I know you tell me. You're there.
honestly, in if we talk about Egypt, for instance, there is a lot of greenfield sites. We only live like right next to the Nile, and literally everything else is empty,
It's
like
free.
completely. It's completely empty, right? And a lot of
There's
actually the
farms.
new develop, yeah, a lot of the new developments that are happening in Egypt right now, the 21 new cities, are actually on empty land. To be honest,
Really?
yeah, it's there is, of course, in certain areas pre-existing communities, but there like the density is pretty kind of low in a sense of it's either Bedouin land or so like people are moving, or like it's owned by three families or this kind of stuff. I'm not really sure about the particulars of every single city
Sure.
that has ownership of it, of course, before. But I know that most land, actually all land in Egypt is owned by some sort of government, and they can just like allocate it to whomever they want, unless it's a private
Wow.
land.
Well, I wish that
Right?
was the case here. We're building a new city in Western Sydney, which is
Yeah,
a part of a part of Sydney that's sort of, it's about, I would say, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour from the core CBD of Sydney.
mhm,
And we've sort of set up our city into three parts. We have an eastern city where most of us live and most of the
yeah,
development is, a middle city called the central city, which is starting to come up, which has a capital, Parramatta,
mhm,
a core
mhm,
city, and then a new parkland city where we've put a new airport, a new industrial precinct, and most of that is farmland. And all the things that you're saying around new rules, new governance is something the government here is fighting very, very hard to achieve. They've achieved, they've started a new authority called the Greater Cities Commission. They're trying to set up rules. They're looking at a special economic zone concept to try and attract new industry around the airport. I don't know if you've ever heard of this term, the aerotropolis. Have you heard of this
Yeah,
term?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
so this is the John Casada book. It's become a public policy thing.
yeah.
We actually now actually have an aerotropolis authority here
Okay. Oh,
that's
interesting.
designed
Okay.
to
Yeah,
sort of build an industrial core
yeah,
around the airport. So I think all the things that you're saying are quite familiar. And from a developer's point of view, we look at it and a lot of the work that's going into it is rule making and planning. They're
exactly.
not ready for us yet. They're not ready for capital, or they're not ready for property development yet, right? It's more like, how do we set this thing up for success? Who's going to live
Yeah.
and work here? Where are the jobs going to come from? We have 4 metro lines under construction at one time here in Sydney, just to deal with the
Yeah.
population growth. So it's yeah, while you're talking about this in an Egyptian context, it has a lot of relevance to what we're trying to do here. And that's why I'm pushing you on, well, how do you do this in a greenfield site? Because I think it's not an easy process by any means to do these things.
It's not an easy process, and this is like a huge part of the research that we do here at CTI, basically developing those reference guides, right? So basically, we're trying to, because we understand like how difficult the process is, so we're trying to, through research and like basically on the ground research and literature reviews and everything that we're doing is trying to um, make it as easy as possible for people to grab books and try to think at least of doing things a little bit differently. So we have, for instance, the governance handbook, which kind of outlines best practices and of legal systems from all over the world. We have the planning guidelines, which also try to look at the planning processes and the mobility designing process a little bit differently when it comes to greenfield sites. We have the industrial policy reference guide as well, which also outlines because industrial policies and best practices from all over the world. Um, because we also, I mean, we're working with a lot of African cities or African new cities, and we do see that need for industrialization because a lot of the urbanization in Africa happened without really much industrialization, and that's
Absolutely.
where
Yeah.
a lot of the problems are coming from. And now all the governments have on their agenda, in, like especially here in Zambia, the industrialization, attracting businesses, and attracting this kind of stuff. So we saw a need to kind of outline a way how can you do this through charter cities or through new cities in general.
So important, right? Because Africa has its number one resource is people, right?
Exactly,
And
exactly.
it's a
This is
bit like
yeah,
India, which is my ethnicity is Indian. Same thing, our number one, India's number one resource is people, right? And so,
exactly.
how do you enable people to sort of develop in a city? And one of the things I wanted to ask you really is around that, because as I was doing my research on the Charter Cities Institute, I noticed that one of your key objectives is reducing poverty through better cities, which coming from a Western country, our approach to these things is more about how do we make our welfare system better. And
Mhm.
living in a wealthy country, you don't realize that people live in absolute poverty in many countries. And I often find when I go to um, emerging market countries, some cities can be very oppressive of the
Yeah.
population. They're
Mhm.
not easy places for people to live better, right? And I was fascinated by that objective. How do you design a city to alleviate poverty? Like, what is it that you need to do? We talked a little bit about industrialization, which obviously is critical, but how do you create a city to alleviate poverty?
So I think here we kind of like really zoomed in on existing uh, kind of cities that somehow try to alleviate poverty. So, for instance, the example of Shenzhen, which is a quote unquote greenfield development. It used to be a it transferred from a small fishing villages in the 80s to now one of the biggest and
It's a mega city.
mega cities around the world, right? And the average yearly income in 1980 was around 137 US dollars compared to 2017, which is around 13,000 US dollars. And you can then go look at Singapore or look at Dubai, and you'll find certain trends of cities that had a different kind of governing systems, because Shenzhen is is a sort of a mega economic city, right?
Mm.
Economic zone, right? And it operated through different rules than the rest of China, which allowed it to attract investment, allowed people to kind of just move in the city and just work and invest there. And we saw like the effect of a city like Shenzhen on the economy and on the even the development of people throughout the years, and what can it do. And this is where it came about, like, oh, new cities or cities can alleviate poverty through attracting good jobs, through attracting investment, through attracting labor, and creating a better life for the people there. And through that evidence-based research, we were like, yeah, so how can we replicate those models, or learn at least from those models to um, direct the new city development that are happening, the government that are interested in building new cities to to face the urbanization challenges, and actually make it work. No, not just make it like a place where people live and then they have to go to the informal economy and all of this
Yeah.
kind of stuff, but create the structures that would attract the investments that would create this kind of stuff. And the thing that in common, the thing that is in common between all of those kind of cities that we saw like a huge economic development happen in a very short time, was that governance system that actually worked on the city level, and the proposed governance changes. And this is where, oh yeah, shorter city makes sense, because then you have a city that can create that economic investment, or can create that economic surplus, but through um, proper governance, it can actually do that. Uh, so yeah.
If you look at the Shenzhen model, because that was, I mean, I was growing up in Hong Kong around that time
Yeah.
when the five economic cities of, or the special economic zones in China were being developed. Um, and you could see the change, across the border when you went into mainland China happen, right? It was just extraordinary to watch. What what was it about the special economic zone model that works? Like, if we were to say there were principles that made that happen in Shenzhen, what were those principles, and how are you applying them now in your thinking for like African cities? Can you replicate it?
Well, replication is like it's yeah. Although I use it sometimes, but I prefer to like lesson learned, right? So there are
Lessons
so
learned.
many lessons learned
You're
from
definitely a researcher. I can tell that, right? That's a
right?
very
See, like
researcher language.
yeah. Exactly, yeah. So the lesson learned, because whenever we also, since I moved to Osaka, and we've been having a lot of meetings with uh, government officials and civil society organizations and this kind of stuff, and then when like I bring up this kind of like examples and like Shenzhen and blah blah blah, and like everyone, oh, can we really create a Shenzhen in Africa? And my always answer is like, no, but we can learn so many things from Shenzhen that can actually work for Africa. And when you say like, what can we replicate, is that we can replicate the fact that Shenzhen focused on investment, focused on attracting investment, and made the labor laws, made the investment laws, made everything super easy for you to just come and invest. And it worked on it attracted a lot of Chinese money from abroad. It attracted a lot of Chinese money within the country itself to just come and easily invest in Shenzhen. And it grew like this, literally. Like, once you read more about it and more about it, then you um, see that that focus on attracting investment, on foreign direct investments, and on creating robust and easy labor laws for everyone to just like work. It actually really works for the country, and this is the kind of lesson that we are trying to focus on with new cities in Africa and all over the world. Is like, again, people cities are labor markets, right? And to attract labor, you need investment, and to keep the labor and to keep the labor and to grow it, you need more investments. And I think this is like the main. There are so many lessons, but this is like the main thing. Make it
Yeah,
easier for
labor
labor to
force
come in.
flexibility. Labor force
Exactly.
flexibility is the key thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think if I look at what I witnessed in China and other places around the special economic zone concept, and I'm not a researcher. I'm a property infrastructure developer, right? But
Yeah.
what we've what I see is countries that have really strong um, boundaries around their special economic zone, where the difference between that zone and other zones in terms of competition are clear. That's the Singaporean story. Strong, extremely strong education and skills training and big investment of government capital into that, including in partnerships with business. And then, the third element of it is really picking a few areas where a city can be successful economically, right? So you look at, I mean, Japan, in coming out of the post-war, it decided it was going to be a manufacturing nation and work very well in certain types of electronics and cars and whatever else. And that was its story. You've seen a similar story come out of Korea in a post-war environment. So I think that, those Asian examples, I agree with you, have great lessons that can be learned from them. I think, well, ironically enough, I think now, Japan's a very wealthy country, but has been in a malaise for quite some time in terms of after it gained all the wealth. Now what?
What exactly?
That's yeah,
Exactly.
that's the question that it's facing now, right, around its demography and how it does that, right? But I think, I unfortunately have never had the opportunity to go to Africa. It's a place I've always wanted to be to, but go to. But it seems to me that it's those elements in many African countries that are kind of struggling. I had a guest on the show some months ago from Rwanda,
Hmm.
and he's an amazing story that he has of being a refugee in Rwanda from the genocide, and then going through a terrible, tragic experience with his family, losing his family during the genocide, but back now in his village,
Yeah.
and developing, his village. But one of the things he was telling me was Rwanda has focused on its capital to make it the Singapore of Africa, and the president Kagame has said, "I'm focusing on this. There's a boundary around our capital. We're going to make it a financial center, and we're going to focus on education, infrastructure, inbound investment, and financial services." And by all accounts, that seems to be working, at least from where I am, 10,000 miles away. Is that the
Oh,
case?
definitely, definitely. And even when you go to like, just honestly, if you just talk to like random people here on the streets and talk about Rwanda, and everyone is super inspired by Rwanda, how they were able to go from basically killing each other on like the streets to now being one of the greatest success stories in all of Africa. And you can see how that is being done through, well, proper governance, or just a focus on infrastructure, and focus on investment, and focus on this kind of stuff. So yeah, Rwanda is doing pretty cool in that sense, and like focusing on the things that need to be focused on. Yeah.
And are other African countries following that model? Are they saying, okay, we're going to draw a line, we're going to do a special economic zone, we're going to focus on these things? Is that what's happening in other African nations?
Yeah, so for instance, the special economic zone, or the MFAs, as they're called here in the legal system, they have a part um, in the legal systems here in Zambia. So they're actually recognized as a robust economic way to as a robust way to create economic surplus in the country. Then you can easily start an economic zone, or try to attract investments, and this kind of stuff. So it is kind of recognized. And also then the new president here, HH, it has like a huge agenda on decentralization. And this is the kind of, when we were thinking where should we place our Africa office, basically around Africa, we were like thinking a lot of Lusaka, and we decide on Lusaka because also the political alignment of this is what the political system wants, right? Robust
So
economic
important.
growth.
Mm.
They already have the special economic zones legal in as a part of the as part of the legal systems in the country, um, and yeah, so other nations are starting to think of that. It's the way of how to implement it. I think this is where the governments are kind of still trying to figure out a way to how to do it. But I would say it's on the agenda of a lot of leaders around sub-Saharan, definitely.
Well, I mean that's fascinating. I think one of the big issues in the development of new cities, in emerging markets in particular, is corruption at a government level, right? So when you have you know, new development, new infrastructure, lots of big contracts, there is a real risk of corruption. And like I don't think it's inappropriate to say Africa has had its share of
Of course.
problems with corruption. How do you deal with that? Like, how do governments deal with that problem?
How do governments deal with the problem? Um, I think again, if you see, like this is also one of like the perks of not doing everything at a national level, right? Because a lot of the people on the national governments are basically the same people who have been recycled again and again and again and
Yes.
again, and the
Yeah.
corruption comes from them. And he was, I don't know, the minister of health, and now he's the minister of. This happens a lot of Egypt. Like you have different roles, completely
Yeah.
different roles, the same person who did them throughout the years, right? And this is why like creating new systems or letting the governance happen at a little bit more of a local level or like city level, that will alleviate the circles of corruption that have been happening on national governments over and over and
By
over.
devolving power and
By
responsibility. Yeah,
exactly, and
that's
not letting it in the same, like, and a lot of the corruption comes also, what I've noticed is from the long processes of bureaucracy, and just taking 40 days to have one signature on a paper that you need out of 16 papers. So I cannot afford to, or well, I can't afford to wait 40 days for that one signature. So I'm going to have to pay somebody. So this bureaucratic kind of structures are just like a they're going to create corruption one way or another. So by alleviating a lot of that bureaucracy and just making things easier, direct,
it will
like
reduce the need for corruption. Yeah,
exactly, it would reduce
so true.
there is nothing to do, like, just if you go online and just have everything done online through, I don't know, a website or whatever, instead of having to wait a year to get 40 different signatures from 40 different institutes. It makes things easier, and there is no way around it, right?
I mean, it's so. I mean, bureaucracy is not a thing that is unique to any one country. Everyone seems to have. It
Everywhere.
seems to be one of the great unifying forces between
Yeah, yeah,
all ethnicities and all races and
yeah, yeah,
all
yeah,
countries. Is that a love of bureaucracy? And
yeah,
it's funny. Sometimes you look at it. We will often price planning time into how we price a development project. I love, I spent some time in government, and when I first came to the private sector, into a development company, the people were telling me about planning risk. There's a planning risk, and I'm like, what
yeah,
is this risk? And it's like, oh, well, it's the risk of the government not giving us an approval within this time frame.
yeah,
And I'm thinking, just coming out of government, I'm like, my goodness, they think of this as a commercial risk. How
of
can
course.
how can the approval of how can a planning approval be a commercial risk? And of course, I experienced it in government with development projects, but it shouldn't be like that, right? It should not be the case
It
where
shouldn't
you
be the
price
case.
risk like.
And that's why I want to talk about it as well, because um so in Egypt, right, you have a lot of corruption, right? I mean, it's an African country, you have a lot of corruption, but you get stuff done, right? So if you pay that certain person or whatever, you can like easily shorten the process of getting things done. But for instance, when I moved to Germany, and they have like a strong bureaucratic system, right, of papers with like signature, then you have to be there at a certain point and get the paper from that guy, and like it's like they have like they love their bureaucracy, right? And I'm like, and I was just like thinking about it, like yeah, corruption is bad and stuff, but like sometimes you get things done by just like figuring out a way.
Yes.
Without corruption, it takes actually longer to get things
Yeah.
done and to get stuff done, and like you have to do everything properly, which is good, right? But also, yeah, it's a little bit inefficient. So
Oh,
like
that's true.
bureaucracy in both ways, whether you have corruption or you have a little bit of leeway to do things or you don't have any leeway to do things, it's just like a nightmare both ways. So yeah,
Well, I think the ideal would be that you just have a system that's streamlined and you don't have to bribe anybody and you can just like get it done,
exactly,
right? But I don't
exactly,
know anybody who lives in any country who says that they've got the most amazing
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
system,
No, no,
and every country's kind of the same, right?
exactly, exactly.
Fascinating conversation, and we can go into so many places, but we'll probably need to end soon. So I'm fascinated from a perspective of the CCI and what you're doing in Zambia. So you've got an opportunity now to tell all of the civil servants all over the world what 3 things you can do to make a great city. What would those 3 things be?
Three things you can do to make a great city. Well, first, like from a planning perspective, it's always I can't always plan with the community, and I'm not saying like have plans and go talk to the community. I mean, just start everything with the people you're doing with. Like think about the community not as your client, but as your partners in planning. So this is the
So you
first thing.
start with them first, and then yeah.
Start with do every single thing with them. There are think about planning as a process of top down and bottom up at the same time. So there are certain things that have to come from top down, like infrastructure and stuff like that. But most of the things you can do it with the community over time. Think about you don't have to get everything done from the beginning. Things can go a little bit longer. So planning is not something that you do and you get done with it. It's a long time process. It evolves as the city evolves, and it evolves as the community evolves, and the market's needs and everything like that. The second thing is think of cities as labor markets. They are labor markets, and people come to cities for the economic opportunities. People stay in cities for the economic opportunities, and people leave cities because of that lack of economic opportunities. So make sure that these economic opportunities are um, thought of at the beginning of creating a city, are thought about again as the city grows, and thought about one more time as the city is, even when you say at a very developed stage. Think of cities as labor markets, include the communities in the planning process, in the sense of think of communities as your partner in planning. And I think the third thing is think of cities as an ever-changing organism. Like it's not especially with new cities. It's not a master plan that you're going to execute and it's going to work. No, cities change. People move in. Markets have demands, and just be adaptable in that, in the sense of creating governance systems that can actually adapt as the city grows. So I think, yeah, those three things, if we can do them, it would be, we will hopefully have a little bit of better cities.
Well, look, I think those are 3 very wise things, and I look forward, hopefully, to visiting one of these new greenfield cities that you're involved in developing in some fascinating places. And I really commend what you guys are doing. I think it's good that we have focus on helping, helping countries understand and helping states or wherever, whatever level of government, understand how we can do things better. And one of the things I really liked was the idea that you could just pick up a guide to how to do things better, because often these things aren't clear, and people don't realize that there are precedences all over the world that you can learn from. And if
Exactly.
you're a civil service and servant in a government department somewhere and you've been tasked with something crazy, oh, there you go. The lights have just gone off here. If you're a civil servant in some department somewhere, the you know, being able to have access to an organization like yours is really special. So thank you so much for the time and for coming on the show. You're welcome here in Sydney anytime.
Thank
I'm
you,
sure we
Jason.
could
Thank you
use
for
your
having
advice. It's a
me.
pleasure.
And yeah, if you ever come anywhere in Sub-Saharan or in Egypt, I would love to take you around and
Well,
show you all this really
I,
beautiful
I
things.
would I would love it. I think it'll be fantastic. Heba Elhanafy.